thank you for joining us today. This is your Crisis Coach session for May, natural disasters, and your organization planning for preparedness. We appreciate your joining and invite you to also connect with us via social media on Twitter at Firestorm Soul, on Facebook at Firestorm Solutions, and the hashtag for this session and all Crisis Coach sessions is Crisis Coach. So if you have a question during the session, we're not able to get to it, and you'd like to share that via Facebook or Twitter, just use the Crisis Coach hashtag, and I'll make sure I see it. You can also email us, of course, at webinars@firestorm.com. Firestorm, as you know, transforms crisis into value, and we're going to talk about that today. We empower you to manage risk in crisis, and our expertise is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd like you to know that this presentation is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion. Any work product provided by Firestorm should be read in conjunction with guidance given by national, regional, and local authorities, as well as, of course, your company or your organization's personal counsel. And the information given should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're very pleased to have this webinar underwritten and sponsored by Virginia Association of Independent Schools. And Ken Mercer is on. Ken is our principal in the Maryland area and also works with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools and Firestorm Services. Ken, would you like to say anything about our wonderful sponsors today?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. We are delighted with the relationship that we've developed with the Virginia Association and their sponsorship of this webinar for the benefit of their members. We also appreciated meeting you at the Williamsburg conference the end of March. So I hope there are some attendees here who attended our session, and look forward to talking to you in the future. I will be the one reaching out to you after this webinar to hear your thoughts and see what we can do for you. So thank you very much, Virginia Association, and thanks to all the attendees.
Thank you so much, Ken. And if you'd like more information on the Virginia Association of Independent Schools, please visit vais.org. I'm also here with Roxanne the Wonder Dog, and so I apologize if you hear her barking in the background. And I'm here with the ever wonderful expert Jim Satterfield. Jim is the CEO of Firestorm, and today we have sort of a special approach we're going to take. We're going to interview Jim about some things that he's taught me over the past 6 years when it comes to natural disasters and protecting schools, students, and our campuses. Jim, do you have any introductory words you'd like to say to our audience today?
Karen, thanks, and Ken, good to talk to you again today, and for everyone in attendance. We appreciate the opportunity to work with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools and talk about these types of problems. Natural disasters are a unique area, and hopefully we'll get into that insight. And unfortunately, that's not a picture of me asleep up on the screen. Karen, back to you.
Well, Jim, you never sleep. That's why we couldn't find one of you asleep. Last month, we've been working through our whole series of Crisis Coach this year in a logical manner. And last month, we talked about what keeps you up at night and would your teams be ready. And one of the things that we did was talk about those major events that happen in an organization on a school campus, the various areas that people were concerned with. And during this session, if you have any questions or you have any comments that you'd like us to consider for this or other sessions, please do use the GoToWebinar interactive dashboard. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little chat area. You can ask questions, and if we don't get to those today through this session, we certainly will follow up. But we talked about mostly brand damage events, hacking, leaks, and data breaches, failures of senior leadership, terrorism, and then natural disaster is really something that people are very concerned with for their organizations. We did a survey of about 900 or more organizations and asked them what crisis event was the #1 for their organization. And certainly cyber is way up there, but secondarily is natural disaster. Jim, do you have any insights as to what we've been finding as we're talking to people about crisis and their concerns?
Well, when we think about all of these areas, we turn on the television or look on the internet or pick up a newspaper, and you'll see everything that's on this page being a story that's aired at that point in time. Now, when we think about cyber, we're thinking about information and identity theft or even HIPAA and public health, personal health information. But look at the loss of life right next to natural disasters. Combining those two, it's about 30%, because that's a lot of times that we see the loss of life tied to that tornado, flood, earthquake area. Now, we could have loss of life in a violent scenario that's tied back up there. So as we look at these are certainly impacts, and we'll talk more about this shortly. If you think about dividing our organizations and our schools into 3 functions. One is the facility, the building, the campus that you have. One are the people that are there, the students, the teachers, the staff, and then lastly, the technology and the information. All of those are clearly referenced here, and we're going to be continuing to talk this year more about the behaviors of concern as we look at those that could escalate to violence. But in thinking about natural disasters, the onset of those, those pictures that we see out of those events are very staggering. So I think it's a good time to sit down and emphasize that, particularly as we come into the summer period. I know schools are out at that point in time, but many of you have a summer session or have a camp at your school. The exposures are still there, and then we need to get ready for fall as we think about back to school at the end of the summer. So Karen, back to you.
Thanks, Jim. And one point that I want to make that you've made to me is if we look at the purple segment of significant reputation event and natural disaster, and if you couple loss of life in there, the importance of that is that many times people don't equate a loss of reputation with a natural disaster. But we know that the manner in which you handle a crisis can really bring value or detract from the value of your organization. So it's important that we take a moment to think about the impact and natural disaster may have on an organization and ask that more important question of could you handle it? Because what we do know is that your ability to handle a crisis, to be resilient, does add value to an organization. Jim, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I think that's one of the most important things I've learned from Firestorm.
Well, when you think about it, and I think you did a good job of pointing it out on the pie chart, because those things are even adjacent to each other as you think in those areas. But people are going to determine the strength of your school, your leadership, your level of preparedness by how you respond at the most critical time. In any disaster or crisis, it's if you're explaining you're losing. Well, we could have done this, but we didn't, and then you give an excuse. That's not going to register as we think about parents and what they're concerned about in each of those areas with their children. Think about the explaining dragging the person off the airplane for United Airlines. There isn't an explanation that's satisfactory there. Now, I know we're going to talk about other other natural disaster events shortly, but the difference between living or dying or being injured or not injured is very close. And so only a few actions can make a significant difference in outcomes. If you heard that someone drowned in a tornado, you go, hey, Jim, you mixed up here. You confused a flood with a tornado. But we're going to share with you in a few minutes that some of the loss of life in Joplin came as a result of students who drowned in the building they were in. So thinking about where you are, relative to the threat that's here is going to make a difference. The picture you've got up on the screen gives you an idea of that devastation around it, and you would wonder, did anyone survive here? We talked about facility and people, but in your case, those people are students. When that parent pulls up at this location, their first concern is, where is my child? And that'll lead us into those other areas. You want me to jump into these points, Karen, or do you want to throw in a lead in?
I would. Let's talk about first what we do. And I think in every session that we've had, folks, those of you who are listening, and we do appreciate your attending each session because they are logically linked together. We've talked about Firestorm's methodology of Predict, Plan, Perform. So Jim, break that down for us.
Well, interestingly, most people in a disaster or crisis immediately jump to the word perform. They're out doing things or saying things. But if you come back, you can figure out that the predict is where we need to start. What are the vulnerabilities and threats that you're exposed to? Here we're focused on natural disasters, and many of those can be geographically linked. If we're thinking about earthquake in California or along the Mississippi Valley, but you remember a couple of years ago we had one that went up the Atlantic seaboard and even affected the Washington Monument there in D.C. So while we're talking today to Virginia, we're not immune there to those types of perils. But if you think about, every state in the Union has had tornadoes. We've had tornadoes in every year. It's not just a spring weather transitional mode as we look at it. So the predict side is, what are the vulnerabilities and threats? What are their impacts if they were to occur? How do we monitor them? And what are the triggers for us to take action? If it's a weather-related event, that's probably one of the few areas that most organizations do a good job in focusing on. Secondly, then, once we've done the predict portion of the planning, what's our plan? And as we think about schools, we're thinking about shelter in place, lockdown, lockout, evacuate. In most natural disaster areas, it is the shelter in place strategy that would be the one that's followed. Moving into hallways, perhaps away from windows for flying glass, or looking at particular areas that would be most safe. And so having a plan so that everyone understands what the commands are, what the actions that they're to take, and how we look at it. By the way, one of the biggest gaps that we find here is that many of the schools we talk with do not, in fact, have a reunification plan. If something were to happen to our facility and the parent can't go there to get their child, where are they to go? How do we deal with that? How do we separate those parents from whose children are okay with those parents whose children are not okay? Having a reunification plan is a fundamental necessity, and most of our schools lack having those. And then finally, under perform, it's not just dealing with the event as it's occurring, it's dealing with the training, the testing of it. What supplies do we need to have, and materials there? Do we have sufficient medical supplies? Do we have search and rescue materials? Do we have a bullhorn that we can communicate with if the electricity is out associated with it? So it's complex, and you just can't jump into action. You've got to know, everybody has to be on the same page at the same time. If we related it to a choir, you could imagine if we had 50 people in the choir and all 50 people were singing different songs at the same time, we'd have a Tower of Babel. We wouldn't have anything where anyone could understand what needs to be done or what everyone else was doing. We need to be on the same place at the same time. Karen?
So that really leads exactly into what Jim is just talking about, which is, have you made your plan? Weather patterns are somewhat predictable, and unlike other disasters or crises, we do have a good deal of notice. When a hurricane is forming, we know we've got, 12 days in order to put things in order and then watch where it comes ashore. And we know what our specific vulnerabilities are on the West Coast, middle of the country, on the East Coast. It's important to understand, for our schools especially, We want to keep people safe in the moment, and then we really do need to have what are the next steps afterward. The E5 tornado that ripped through Joplin left 4,200 children with nowhere to go to school, and they are still rebuilding today. So that leads us to what Firestorm has taught me. And I lived for many years in snow states, so I can drive on snow and ice, although I don't like to. What I wasn't prepared for was hurricane and flooding, because I hadn't experienced it before. And fortunately, I work for a company that taught me how to deal with those things. And Jim taught me that disaster readiness and value go hand in hand. So I'd like to talk about that, Jim, because I think it's the core for so many independent schools, especially when we're talking to parents and others about not only educating their children but keeping them safe, why it's such an important thing for us to emphasize.
Well, I think your story was very good, Karen. You know what you know. You know snow, you know, understand driving in that. But if we look at those other three buckets, you know what you know what you don't know, but the biggest one is what you don't know you don't know. And my prayer for everyone on the call today is that they don't experience the picture that was on the previous slide. But imagine how the parent would feel pulling up to that school and seeing that building. There would be terror in their heart at a very high level. Assuring them in advance that we have policies, that we have procedures, that we're trained in emergency response, what everybody needs to manage an incident, how we respond, how we recover and get our school back up and running, and what we're going to deal with that. And being able to do it, and then that reunification issue that we talked about earlier becomes so very, very clear and critical at each step. So there are threats out there. They certainly can happen, and the tornado is a great example of that event, and we've seen it happen many times. I spoke to a group of businesses, and they were in the roofing business. And one of the gentlemen there had a plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that was destroyed by the tornado. They then rebuilt in Joplin, Missouri, and it was then subsequently destroyed a year later. I did ask him where he was planning to go next because I wanted to make sure I didn't go to that particular town. But these types of events come and happen every year. We see those stories. We understand the impacts, whether it's the flood, the tornado, the winter storm. Those are events for us to focus on.
And so in this specific approach to first assessing what the threats are for our specific organization and understanding how we can use predictive intelligence to go ahead and make sure that we walk through those scenarios. We then want to make sure we have a plan, and that plan, part of that is the threat analysis and then understanding how to categorize those threats. And all of this can bring value to our organizations. I think that's the bottom line. I think what makes me concerned, Jim, is that oftentimes I think you can go to different people in an organization or a school, especially a significantly large campus, if you have a few thousand students. But whether you have 100 students or 10,000 students, you want to be able to hear the same message from everyone when you ask them what your mission, what your values are. More importantly, you want to be able to say, if we had a flooding situation, what are your first steps, and have them know. So one of the areas that Firestorm has looked at in the 5 common failures in a crisis or a disaster is failure to train. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and there are 5 common, and that's actually the second largest failure, the failure to train, and then the third one is right behind it, the identify and monitor, and the fourth is training and updating your plans, testing and updating your plans. As you look at those, this is a terrifying picture. If you imagine if you were a parent here with a child at the Plaza Towers or the Briarwood Elementary, you'll notice just behind the areas where it says identified common failures is where the hospital is. It was hit. So if you're taking out the hospital, you're directly hitting two schools. This is a devastating event. Imagine the confusion and panic as the parents tried to get to that location to see their child. And those are the factors that we want to make sure that we've done and communicated it with the parents to let them know what our plans are and that they clearly understand. Because when you add the response from the parents in these types of locations, you're going to have even more confusion at a time when you need to have a great deal of clarity. Karen?
So, Jim, you've trained hundreds, if not thousands, of schools. When you go into a school or when you first sit down and start to devise a plan with a school, what's the best way for anyone on this call to start? A lot of people say, well, we've got a plan. We know our security's okay. You know, we think we're covered. Where do you start with an organization that looks at this in that way?
Well, first of all, you've got an advantage with schools. You've been in the area. Your building has been there for a while. You know what you're subjected to. And I think where you talked about a security assessment, walking around and looking at it, and we are concerned about physical security even here. But if I worked with a school in Tennessee just last month, and they have a gigantic campus. We're talking, I think it's 700-800 acres, and it's heavily wooded. There's a lake on it. But there's public access and coming through part of their property and looking at it. And if you look at the history of events that they've had there, they've seen over the course of their 100-year plus experience, a little bit of everything at each individual point. So the all hazards approach, listing those out, looking at that ramping of impacts, and certainly Ken can help you if you would like to know a little bit about where to start from that, becomes essential. But for every one of those things you list, how do you know about it? What are you going to monitor? What's the trigger to activate your plan? What are you going to communicate? What are you going to do? And have you trained and tested on it? So those are the ideas that all start to come together. And if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves just winging it, working on off the top of our head, and we're going to have a suboptimal response. So looking at that, making sure that everyone understands, and do a walkthrough. You do a fire drill for your school automatically. You're required to do so. But I would recommend that during the course of the year that you do drills related to other natural perils. And one of those drills, do them with the students outside of the building. That step is generally missed at most of the schools that we've worked with, where they didn't do it. The alarm goes off and you have people out on the sports field. What are they to do? Where are they to go? How do you deal with those types of issues?
And Jim, for our Virginia schools and those of us on the Eastern Seaboard, we have some significant threats from flooding. As a matter of fact, we saw in my neck of the woods, I'm in South Carolina, we saw a 1,000-year flood event. And many schools were caught off guard by the severity of the event and by the secondary disasters that were created as the water began to recede. Our rivers then overflowed their banks and caused a secondary crisis.
And I was going to just jump in with that. You've got the illness and the bacteria that would come associated with it. And Karen, you pointed out something that's very important here, is think about how that's going to confuse the commuting to school. Access, bridges may be out. I live in Atlanta. We had our highway burned down a few weeks ago. And clearly, I guarantee you, no school in Atlanta had, okay, the freeway's going to burn down. What's our plan associated with it? But disruptions here will affect communications, transportation, as well as the operation of the facility too. And loss of power is to be expected at this point.
And that's really what we want to stress. The third crisis that happened in our 1,000-year flood event was that I think 30% of the roads washed away. So even if with the schools were okay, you couldn't get students to the school. We didn't have alternate methods of people said, well, we can do web-based training. Well, we have no power. So there was a multitude of complexity of the challenges that we face, and many in North Carolina and some parts of Virginia still do. It was a significant event. And part of the challenges that we saw in that, Jim, were communication. It was really difficult to get information out. I use this image because I mentioned this last month, last month a hacker was able to hack into the Dallas tornado warning system, weather warning system, and turn on all of the sirens over a 2-hour period. And that's a concern, because if you can get in to hack them on, you can get in to hack them off. So in addition to considering how you need to communicate with your community, your students, your parents, we also need to be aware of how those entities communicate with us. Do you have some observations on this, Jim?
Well, Murphy was an optimist. So when we think about, what could go wrong, will go wrong, and to put it together, you better a false alarm as those sirens going off than what you pointed out. They could have been turned off, and when people needed the information, they wouldn't get it. And by the way, how do parents know that that communication is you? How do they know to rely on it? Do they know physically what to do? Many of the breakdowns that we see come as a result of failures in those communications. The points you've got to consider up on the screen is the first communication that we're ever going to give in a crisis environment is coordination. What do you want people to do? What should they be doing? The crisis portion of the communication is about brand and reputation, and then compliance is the third level. Generally, the second and the third will come after the event, but that initial coordination, it's easier to edit than it is to create. You want those communications written out so that the commands are very clear and specifically understood. And because it relates to the life and safety and health of everyone that's involved. As we continue on, you'll see that there may be other notifications that we'd have to perform, and what you can and cannot talk about after the event becomes a big differentiator. Karen listed there the 3 messages around Virginia Tech that really relate back to brand and reputation, that they wouldn't be defined by the event, that they would invent the future, and that they would embrace the families. Those are good at that point and are obviously phenomenally better than talking about why you didn't turn the alarm on or why you didn't go into to shelter in place, because if you're explaining, you're going to be losing in each one of those things. So looking at what the roles and responsibilities are, having a spokesperson, and here's a big recommendation: don't have your spokesperson the head of the school. The head of school needs to be running the crisis, overseeing what's being dealt with, and having that control factor there, and having specific roles. And if you're going to have a communicator, have they been trained and involved in those directions? You have a significant advantage in an independent school. You know how to reach your students, you know how to reach your parents, you know how to reach your faculty and staff. Communicate directly with them. Do not communicate through the media, because they have other objectives there. And then give them a channel. Is it an alternative website? Is it a Facebook page that you put up? Is it a call-in number? Because every parent is going to want to talk and understand what's going on. So what channels do you in fact have in place? Karen?
That's a great point, Jim. And I think I keep saying I know it's important to have the demographics of each channel. We know that we see in this specific demographic of 35 to 45-year-old or a little bit younger, we see a lot of activity on Facebook. So we want to make sure that we are distributing good information on Facebook, because we have a lot of parents who are going to be leveraging that. As that demographic moves on, we may start leveraging other applications, such as Instagram or even Snapchat to get our message across as this group of students moves on to their next adventure and we start welcoming new students in. So it's important to stay on top of what communication applications are being used. Also, we may lose the ability to communicate via our website if our servers are local. And so we must make sure that we have the ability to communicate through other applications, and that the ownership of that communication is not solely in one person's hands who may or may not be able to communicate during the crisis. So Jim has, we must be 3 deep on a crisis. We have 3 people on this call today. In case one of us for some reason loses power, we all have access to content, we all have access to speak with you, and we all have access to control what's going on. It takes a little more effort, but we believe it's the right thing to do. Now, for me, this image is an important image because it is from the recent situation with Hurricane Matthew. One of my folks went around and gathered and took a lot of photographs. You're going to be seeing some of those soon. I took some images myself, and this is one from FEMA where a road absolutely washed out that went along the ocean. And we found that no one could go anywhere for quite some time. I have friends a mile away that couldn't get out because their whole area flooded. So, Jim, when students can't come to school to be taught, when teachers can't come to school to teach, when parents can't get to their own jobs in order to work, what do we do?
Well, the big thing is we need to have that question now and talked about and discussed in your school. And to go back to the communications area, you don't want to suddenly say, okay, we'll go to Facebook to communicate if you haven't set that up and tested that in advance. So testing how you're going to deal with students if they can't come to school, why don't we take a Friday some week and say, we're going to assume the roads are out in our area and we're going to do school differently today, and go through one day of what that's like. You'll find out that not everybody has access, not everyone can call in, not everyone else can do that. But to assume that there would never be a disruption in school is not a valid assumption for any school in America today. Virginia covers a wide range of territory. You have a variety of different experiences. You're already used to having a winter storm. You could have a hurricane impact. You could, and as we saw a few years ago, we could even have an earthquake impact associated with it. So looking at and testing what those alternatives are and establishing that in advance of, this is the site where we'll put up the reading assignment. This is the site that we're going to share that information. And as you've started to talk about staff, what staff is needed, can they do it here? Can do it from an alternative facility? Do you have a relationship with another school in the area that you can run classes there, or a church or another organization? So what are those requirements? And have the solutions been tested? There's a capital T on tested on that slide, and it's not a typo. We really wanted to emphasize, if you haven't tested it, it's not going to work the way you think it is. There's going to be a problem because maybe that alternative site has lost power. That's not going to do you any good, and you can't use that facility. Now, we're working with a school outside of the continental United States, and their leadership is very creative. They're saying, well, look, if we can get them in a building, the kids can sit on the floor, and we'll sit around and we'll talk. And they put themselves in that scenario to be able to deal with that environment. The same thing must be true for your school.
Jim, is there a formula to budget? How much time is needed to plan all of this through? Well, one of the things we hear quite often from folks is we just don't have the bandwidth to take care of this now. My answer back is, do you have the bandwidth to take care of it after the crisis occurs? And that could really be an organization killer. Can you talk about?
Yeah, and if I'm not talking about it, just asked me a follow-up to push. I just wanted to pour concrete around what you just said to say it's really important. If you don't have time to do it now, you certainly aren't going to have time to do it in the middle of a crisis. We have to do this now and look at it. This is deferred maintenance. You need to view it that way. And if the board for your school or your trustees, board of directors or trustees haven't set this as a priority, they should have a motion directing senior leadership to put these plans in place and to make sure that they're there and funded. If you had a leaky roof and you're saying, well, we'll fix it next year and then we'll fix it next year and then we'll fix it next year, sooner or later the rot that comes in through the water leakage is going to cause that to be a significantly greater expense. So as an average here, you should look at your budget and say just maintaining our plans, updating them, training and testing them, getting the supplies in, paying for the personnel time that's involved should run about 2% of our budget. If you haven't been running that level, then my comment is you've got a lot of deferred maintenance from a planning standpoint. So you're going to need to do a little catch up. In many cases, you could have an outside group help you accelerate it. By the way, that could be Firestorm, and Ken and his team would be delighted to help you get caught up or to evaluate or even to evaluate where your plan is relative to standards and best practices. If you've got a limited budget, where do you get the most bang for your buck? What is it that you need to focus on and look in those individual areas? So it is going to take some time. It is going to take somebody. And let's go back to those three things. You know what you know what you don't know, but you don't know what you don't know. And you may not be planning for the very thing that's going to make a difference. And unfortunately, this area in many cases can be a life or death situation. Karen?
Thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate that insight to it because we hear that question quite often. I know I've told my pizza, or maybe there's a healthier option for lunch on a Friday afternoon, and let's just sit and talk about these things so that at least we've had the conversation at the very least. It actually is a lot easier to plan than I think people recognize once you get the conversation started. You know, the image we're looking at right now is about 5 houses away from my house. Right after Hurricane Matthew hit, and we got a relatively mild hit here in Charleston, South Carolina. The impacts north of us from flooding were much greater than anyone had anticipated. And I'd like to say our neighborhood was prepared. I'm more prepared today than I was during the event. What we weren't prepared for was that, as in any event, we had significant tree damage. We have living oaks all throughout our area, and they came down, was saturated, and the wind was strong and blocked the roads. So we weren't able to get anywhere anyway, even if we wanted to, until officials came through and cleared the roads. But when they came down, they also took down power. And we thought we would have our power back in a relatively short period of time. But for some reason, it was more challenging in our area, and we didn't have power for, I think it was a good 6 days. And that wasn't even the longest many people were without. So for those of you on the call today, I want you to think for a moment, those of you who are joining as a team, what is the longest any of you have been without power in your lifetime? Now, if you grew up in a small cabin in a really rural area that you went to the stream and cracked the ice to get water, don't count that. But in your daily lives right now, what's the longest you've been without power? Jim, how about you?
And that's an ice storm in Atlanta, and we were caring for elderly parents, one with Alzheimer's, and that was a grueling week because we didn't have heat and other impacts associated with it. And you become increasingly concerned, and every hotel was overwhelmed. There was no chance to go elsewhere. And trying to warm a house via a fireplace and feed a family via a fireplace is a tough way to go. And in your picture here, I would tell you that going to school tomorrow, that family isn't going to be there as they look, and then look at the damage that's been sustained. It's a tough environment here associated with it. And by the way, Karen, I saw a question that came up just in the meantime. There will be a briefing today's webinar, and you'll have access to some of the lists and information that we've been talking about. So Karen, back to you. I'm sorry to jump in.
No problem. I just wanted to make that point because during Hurricane Hugo, and I know that's ancient history for some of the folks on this call, but it's right in my backyard. But during Hurricane Hugo, the people across the street from me, they lost their house completely. It was destroyed completely. And my neighbors who were here for it said it was a little over 3 weeks until the power came back on. So it's important that we think through, not the fact that we might be without power for a couple of days, but what if we were without power? Just assume it's not going to come back on. How are we going to go ahead and maintain until that time? Jim told me about the hand crank on the right-hand side. There are a variety of them out there. It's one of the best things ever. And we invested in a small but really fantastic generator and worked with our neighbors, and we work really hard with our community and our neighbors so that we know who has tools we need, who has expertise we need, and we leverage that expertise, and we're able to be up and running until our power came back on very efficiently, and our neighbors all worked together. When we deliver this brief to you, there are some points to consider just on general personal safety, and this does not address an earthquake or some other areas. You can find information on that on our website, firestorm.com. Under resources, we have a book that Jim and Harry Rulin and Susie Laughlin, the founders of Firestorm, wrote together that really walks you through some of the challenges that may occur. But in the last moments of our session today, this is another photograph I took from my area after people started cleaning up. And this was the size of some of the trees that came down. And the biggest conversation afterward was, where do we go for money? Who's going to help us? And so, Jim, this is your area of expertise. What happens now?
Well, in the time to find out you're not covered is not in the middle of the crisis or the disaster in the aftermath. So look at the scenarios that could potentially affect your location. Write an email to your insurance broker and say, tell me how we're covered for these perils. And they will be glad to do that so that you have those elements that are there. Good recommendations on your screen that's up now about establishing a crisis management structure, getting open source intelligence, doing how you're going to test and make these decisions, and then what the responses are. So it's critical to think about all of this in advance. And one comment to underscore what Karen was sharing with you. In today's world, you need to be ready to handle not getting support or relief for a minimum of 1 week. That's an important element.
I'm sorry, Jim. I thought you were going to keep going there. You know, this is my favorite slide from Firestorm, because what I really want us to be, all of us on this call, I want us to live in a strategic culture of maturity. I want us to be mature organizations. We don't want everything that happens to us to be a surprise. We don't want everything to force us into reactive mode. We want to work toward that supportive organization where we care about our students, our families, our teachers, our staff, and our community, and we are proactive so that we can ultimately become a mature culture of strategic thought, a resilient culture. That's the most important thing we can do for everyone comes into our organization. That includes vendors, visitors to our campuses. Now, after the session today, you can download the brief, which is a Q&A with Jim Satterfield. We hope to have that up for you within the next 48 hours. Prior to that time, there are a ton of great resources that you can access. And again, we really appreciate your joining us today. More than anything, we would like to show our appreciation to the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. As you know, you can reach out to Ken Mercer, who's on this call. You can contact us at webinars@firestorm.com, and we'll make sure you have that information. And you can start your assessment at no fee because of the support from Virginia Association of Independent Schools. And we'll get that scheduled for you. Jim, any closing thoughts today for our folks on the call?
We hope you never need any of the things we talk about. Unfortunately, every year we find schools that have these types of events impacting them. We're a little over our 45 minutes that we had allotted to speak with you today. Feel free to reach out. Ken, I know we didn't have a chance to take all the questions on air. If you would call everyone individually, I think that's going to make a difference. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for everything you do every day to make our schools safer. We appreciate it. Karen?
Thank you and goodbye. This will end our session for today, and thank you, Jim. We've really enjoyed it.